We can't choose what happens to us. We're helpless as children. We get no choice. But we get to choose what we do with it. Whatever that pain is, whatever that adversity is, right? When we find, okay, I can't go over it and I can't go under it, I have to go through it. Once we do that, I believe all pain has purpose. All of it. We just have to get on the other side of it and decide what we're going to do with it.
Hey everyone, this is Rod Cate and welcome to this week's episode of Rocket Motivation. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Gat Creek, a furniture manufacturer designing and crafting beautiful handmade wood furniture, all in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. Visit gatcreek.com. This week's guest had a tough past. She was sexually abused from childhood through her adolescent years. Her mother, who was also a victim of sexual abuse, had this week's guest at age 15. This week's guest was basically abandoned by her mother, leaving her with no stability. During her teenage years, even when she thought she might be safe, the sexual abuse continued. This week's guest is going to tell her story of dealing with her past and how she overcame it. She is a mother, a college graduate, has completed seminary, and is the program director of I Heart World, an organization that helps young women who have been victims of sex trafficking. The story you're about to hear is amazing on so many levels.
3, 2, 1.
Crystal Yarbrough, welcome to Rocket Motivation.
Wow. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So, Crystal, let's start by getting everybody up to speed. If you would tell the listeners kind of where you are now in your life, you know, what you do, family, that kind of stuff.
Okay. So I am the mother of one. I have a daughter. She's 25. And I recently became a grandmother. I say recently. She's a year and a half. And I am, as you said, I'm the program director for I Heart World. I started volunteering for the organization in 2015 and came on staff about a year and a half later and have worked for them ever since. I was the Alabama director until 2020. And then I moved into the role of program director. So I oversee programming, development, and implementation for both locations.
Okay. And we're going to get into the I Heart World more in depth later. So, you know, take us back. I know this may be a difficult thing to do, but kind of take us back to your childhood when the sexual abuse started and, describe that time and how it started and just kind of take us through your adolescent years.
Okay. I'll preface it by saying that when you first reached out for me to do this, I thought, oh, sure, I'll come and talk about what I do. I'll talk about the girls we serve. And then you made it clear, I want to know about you personally. And so, as I shared with you, this is a journey that it's easier for me to talk about how the ladies we work with, how they've been through much and been through so much and how they're worth fighting for. But going back and telling my own is a little more difficult. So thank you.
Yeah. And I know that, we talked about that. I know you're not used to really telling your story, especially here on a podcast. And so I thank you so much for being willing to do that, because I know you thought, oh, great, yeah, I'll talk about I Heart World all the time. But I think it's so important because what you do at I Heart World, given your experiences, that, I mean, it just makes you, just so valuable for that organization. And so that's why I think you telling your story just makes it even better.
Well, thank you very much. And I am a firm believer that we should always be pushed out of our comfort zone. So thank you for pushing me out of my comfort zone. But back to your question, I can't really tell you when I was first, when the first sexual abuse started. I don't remember exactly. I just have initial experiences that I remember. So I guess the easiest way to say that is I can't recall a time in my childhood when I wasn't being sexually abused by someone. And it was not the same person throughout all of my years, simply because I didn't live in the same place in my entire childhood. I lived in a lot of different places. I was sexually abused by babysitters, family members, people who would come over to the house, boyfriends, my mother's boyfriends. I lived with her for a period, and then I grew up with my aunt for several years, and she had boyfriends in and out and men in and out of the house. So like I said, I can't recall a time when somebody wasn't. And it was just the norm for me. That's how I knew, that's what intimacy was to me. That's what I knew my role and my place was. And sooner or later, that's always what would transpire. And I believed that it was my fault. And that's something that underlies I don't know any other abuse, any other form of abuse where the victim believes that they are complicit in their abuse somehow. But yeah, I always believed that I was, and I can remember adult women telling me that. And so I believed that. But that was my role. That was the role that I played. That was how that's the only attention that I ever remember.
Well, and I guess you say that was the role that you played, but I mean, you didn't know any other role, did you?
I didn't. So I'll give you an example, and I don't think I shared this with you, but so I say that people told me that it was my fault. Up until the first grade, I didn't live in any place consistently. So I was back and forth with my parents, but they would just take me and leave me with a babysitter or with a family member, like, hey, can you keep her for the night? And then they wouldn't come back for several weeks. And so at one point, I was with my dad's sister and her husband and their children. And her husband was touching me inappropriately. And there was a blanket covering us. And I can remember her coming into the room and pulling the blanket off. And she made me, and I may have told you this, she made me stand up. And it was before I was in the first grade. And I remember it so clearly. She pulled the blanket off and she made me stand up. And she told me that I was a slut. And then if my mom didn't come back and get me by the end of the day, that she was calling Child Protective Services to come and get me. And I remember being so afraid that I didn't know what that meant at that time, but I just knew that someone was going to come get me and was so ashamed. So there's that imbalance of power, right? And sexual abuse confuses victimization with intimacy. And that's something I know now, but of course I didn't know it then. And I grew up just always expecting that.
The question I was going to ask is, was there anybody that you could confide in and try to get help? But I guess living in the situation, there just wasn't anybody.
Right. So we look at it from our perspective now. There has to be somebody who cares about this child, right? But when you grow up that way, there isn't anybody. No one in your life is ever consistent. And so that is kind of part of my story that I share occasionally is growing up the way that I grew up, I learned two things. One is no one in my life was ever permanent, because I would go from my mom to my dad to then my dad's girlfriend to this family member to that family member and then to my aunt and then to someone else. But no one in my life was ever permanent. And so because of that, that meant that whatever pain they inflicted on me was only temporary. So as long as I could keep that inside of me and never let them break me inside, what I felt like, give them what they want and they'll go away. And so that was really the way that I grew up. And I lived that way for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, after a while, that's got to take its toll from a young child to teenage years. I mean, how'd you deal with it?
So, looking back, we are created in this amazing ability to survive, to adapt and survive. And so I learned how to survive. And the one area that I did well and I felt like I got approval was academically. No matter what was going on in my life, I could do well in school. And so I would go to school and my teachers would tell me how smart I was. And looking back now and knowing what I know, having a degree in early childhood education, I look at them like, I don't know how I was able to do well, other than that's the one place where I felt like someone cared about me and they encouraged me. And so I would go to school and I would just work really hard to make good grades. And that's one area that I feel like no one could take that away from me. And then you take that into knowing that in my mind, my own parents don't want me, right? I like to refer to it as a label. There are these lies, I think, that we allow to become labels in our lives. And we most often learn those at an early age because of whatever circumstances, and it may be I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm, not this or whatever it might be. Whatever your label is different than my label. But my label was you're too hard to love. I call those, a label and also a lie. Like a therapist would refer to that like as a core belief, something that kind of steers everything that we do. And so in my life, I believed you're not worth loving. You're too hard to love. And so because of that, I adapted. Well, that's okay because I'll never let anyone close to me. I'll never let anyone get close enough to me that they can have a chance to leave me or hurt me. So once I can control right? Because it's a lot of it's about having no control. So you just find things that you can control, and you just take those, and they just become your power because you are a powerless person.
Right. So when the abuse stops, I guess when you're into your teenage years or later, you've taken all this this past of yours, this horrific abuse that you've dealt with since you were a child, and so now you're an adult and it has stopped. How at this point do you go through life, or do you start going through life and you can somewhat control this? I mean, how does that affect your relationships with everybody?
This is an atrocity that happens to children, whatever it might be, right? The sexual abuse, any type of abuse is it's an atrocity that happens to children. But once the fairy comes on your 18th birthday, when you turn from 17 to 18, you're responsible for your own decisions, right? All of a sudden, you need to get your crap together. And I mean, I say that because I see that all the time. And it's like, but these 18 years of what life has taught me doesn't just go away. Now, all of a sudden, I need to take care of myself with all the tools, right? Because that's our job as parents, is to equip our children with the tools that they need to go out into the world. And so I took the tools that life had taught me, and I often describe it as, I was like a train going warp speed the wrong way down the track. I was absolutely insanely self-destructive. And not just self-destructive, I was destructive to any person who got in my path.
What time frame are we talking there? Like when you turned 18 or young adult?
Yeah. Well, I would say for years after that. So I graduated at 17, and I experimented with drugs for a few months, and I had my own apartment, and then I met this guy, and I was pregnant. I got pregnant around the time I turned 18. I found myself alone, pregnant. I got really, really sick. I did not have a relationship with anyone. I didn't know how I was going to support myself. And I thought, the last thing I want to do is bring a child into this world. Like, I don't know how to be a mom, but I often say, and it's true, I believe it to be true, that having my daughter, she saved my life.
And why do you say that?
Because I've looked for statistics. There's no statistic that I can find that demonstrates that I should be where I am in my life right now. Every statistic says I should be on welfare, dead, in prison, on drugs. I have two sisters who are both addicts. They've both been in prison. My mother was an addict until 2011. She was in an active addiction. My dad was in drugs. He was arrested. I can recall a time in 2011 when I went to the computer and looked up every single member of my immediate family's mugshot.
It sounds like you were heading down that path.
I was.
And then you had your daughter, and that changed it.
It did. And so I look at it, when we come to that place, we come to that crossroads in our life, right? So like you say, like, okay, well, no one else has this power over me anymore, right? We get to choose what we do with it. We can't choose what happens to us. We're helpless as children. We get no choice. But we get to choose what we do with it. And I hated the life that I had so much. I can also tell you that exactly 1 year to the day before my daughter was born, I attempted suicide. And then I experimented with drugs for months before I found out I was pregnant with her. And then all of that stopped. And I wasn't so sure. For years and years, I still didn't love me. But I had her, and I never wanted her to experience anything that I experienced. And the one thing that I knew that I could do at that time, I knew that what I could offer is that she would never grow up in this world and be alone. And so I wanted her to have a different life than I ever had. I never wanted her to know the pain. I never wanted anyone to violate her body. I never wanted her to experience. Like, I can remember in the old house where I grew up in with my aunt. I still have dreams about that house to this day, but I remember what a tormented teenager I was. I remember just crying out, just wanting somebody to love me. And I remember being on the floor, there was a bookshelf in there, and I would just cry and cry. And I would just say, I don't even know why I'm in this world. Like, why am I even here? In 2018, I went back to the house where I grew up with my aunt for the first time since I left there at 15. And I stood outside of that house and I just sobbed. And I cried so much for the girl who grew up inside of that house. And I remember I wrote to one of our girls shortly afterwards because the Rose Center was awarded the FBI Director's 2018 Director's Community Leadership Award, and I got to fly to D.C. and meet Director Ray. And the night before I flew to D.C., I was flooded with those memories of going back and looking at this house. And I thought, like, I wish I could tell the girl in this house and how sad she was that it won't always be this way, that she has such a future ahead of her, that there's so much love in her future. I thought there's no reason I should get to fly and meet the director of the FBI growing up the way that I grew up, right? But I did. There's such an whatever it is, it has to be something that's outside of us that catapults us to be different. You know, it has to be an external reference point, whatever that might be.
Well, at least to start. And you mentioned earlier that, you got to love yourself. How do you get to that point?
That's a great point. And for me, it was a journey. I am a believer, and I loved my daughter. And every time I looked at her, I knew that she was not an accident, that she was so beautiful and she was so perfect. And children encompass everything that's so good in this world. And that's pure. And there's just such a pure innocence about them. And so every time I looked at her, I knew that. I remember one day coming to, okay, well, if I believe that about her, that her life was created with infinite worth, and she is infinitely valuable, then that means that either I am too, my life is too, or God's not who he says he is. And I had to make a choice there because I didn't believe that my life was. I thought somehow I was damaged. Because if that's true, then God's a God of hierarchies. And that's not who God says he is. He's not a God of hierarchies. It's not survival of the fittest. And I had to come to that place. And it was a long journey because those labels, I recently went through a divorce. And I can tell you that core belief, that label, instantly came back to me. You are too hard to love. That voice was so loud, a voice I had not heard in a long time. That's right. You're too hard to love.
I mean, how did you even get to the point where you could trust men in a relationship when you could actually make the choice yourself to engage in a relationship? I mean, God, how hard was that?
Oh, it was horrible. And mainly it was horrible because I, for years, did not want to need anyone. And that was the thing. I don't need you. I don't have to need you, whatever that is. And so it was a long journey for me. And I still, right now, even having gone through a divorce that devastated me, I still don't like to hear comments that, men are terrible or men are, what, because I live with me and I know that I'm just as imperfect as the next person, right? But it was a long journey. I can remember being diagnosed with PTSD at 22. I didn't understand it. My way of coping for a while, for probably the first 10 years of my daughter's life, is I read everything I could about addiction. I read everything I could about sexual abuse. I read everything that I could because I needed to. I'm a very logical person. Something has to make sense in my head before it can ever get to my heart. And so I wanted to learn everything I could so that, one, I didn't carry bitterness with me through my life. I don't believe that love and bitterness can live in the same heart. One overtakes the other, whether we want it to or not. But we can't carry both of them. And I didn't want to carry bitterness because when you do, it overtakes everything. And I wanted to learn how to let that go. And so it became a journey. And the more that I learned and the more that I accepted things that I knew to be true, I was able to forgive my parents. I was able to understand things about generational trauma. Sexual abuse is generational in most cases. And so now where I am in my life, in my mid-40s, and it takes a lot of energy to be angry. It takes a lot of energy to distrust people, to try to have the upper hand. And I lived that way for so long because I had to. But now I have a choice, right? I can either look at people with compassion because that's how I want people to look at me, or I can look at them and write them off. But I don't want to do that.
Well, and along those lines, let's talk about the relationship with your mom. But if there was anyone that would have been justified to say, I don't want anything to do with my mom the rest of my life, person would be you. But you didn't do that. So tell me about where you are now with your relationship with your mom.
Whew, I love my mom so much. Sorry. And I'm just so grateful. I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to have a relationship with her because when I truly learned my mom's story. My mom was sexually assaulted when she went to spend the night with a friend at 14 years old, and she got pregnant, the result of that sexual assault. And her mother wanted her to have an abortion. And when she got to the doctor, my mom couldn't do it. She was terrified. And so she was forced to have the baby and then pretend that the baby was her mother's. And that's awkward. That's weird at 14. And my mom and her sisters were also sexually abused by their mother's boyfriend or husband. And their mother divorced him and then got back together with him. And so by the time my mom was 14 and a half, she had met my father, who had just gotten back from Vietnam. And then she got pregnant with me. My Lord, like, look at what she was dealing with, right? And so she goes through life only knowing how to cope by using drugs. Nobody stopped to say, hey, you know what? I don't want anything from you. That's the kind of world I grew up in, and that's a lot like the ladies and the girls we serve group, as everything is transactional, right? You don't just love someone just because you love them. I didn't know that kind of love growing up. I didn't know what it felt like for someone just to care about me and not ask anything in return. You're always waiting for someone. All that to say, my mom has been clean for, February of 2012, she went into a program. She was allowed to be transferred from Florida here, and I went and actually picked her up from jail. She was accepted to a program here, and she's been clean ever since, and she lives not far from me, and she doesn't move because she has never lived close to me, and she still struggles. You know, with her, she started therapy, and she was so proud that she is volunteering at the library now, and I'm like, Mom, nobody goes to the library anymore. But, you know, she's so proud because that's not anything she knew, you know, and so I get to watch her. But I can remember after she graduated from her program, and she stayed with us for a couple of months, and I'll never forget this. I mean, it was so awkward because here we are, two adults who've never known each other, right? And then she's living under my roof. And I remember one day she was teaching me how to garden because, you know, that's not something you grow up learning how to do. And she was teaching me how to, like, put coffee grounds in my soil and stuff. And she stopped and she looked at me and she said, you know, if there's ever anything you want to ask me, you can. And I said, about what? And she said, about anything. Anything you want to ask me about growing up or anything you want to know. And if you need closure. And I looked at her and I said, Mom, thank you for saying that, but you don't owe me an explanation. I understand that you were just doing the very best that you knew how. You were a child. I'm not angry with you. Don't live the rest of your life hating yourself because I don't hate you. And she said to me, you know, when you used to come and see me, when we would go and visit her when she was in that program, I'll never forget this part. She said, you used to make me so uncomfortable. And I said, why? And she said, because you would leave and I would think, she's not really like that. Nobody's really that nice. Nobody's really that happy. She's like, I thought like your husband probably beat you she said, but now I'm here and I live under your roof. And she told me because it's like she wanted to apologize. She said, and I realize that's really how you are. You're really that person, she said. And I've never known anybody like you. And I thought, in a way, that's so weird. That's my own mom, right? But she never lived in a world that was not manipulative.
Let's fast forward it a little bit. But all right, so you graduate from college, you get your degree in childhood education, and then you go to seminary and graduate from seminary. So here you are, you've got this past that you've had, you've got your education to learn how to teach children or elementaries, and now you've gone through seminary, and you're pretty well equipped, I would think, based on your past and your education, to do what you do at iHeartWorld. First of all, tell us what iHeartWorld is.
So we are an anti-human trafficking organization, and we serve only in the United States. So we do not work with any international victims and survivors of sex trafficking. All of our work is domestic. And in a nutshell, so we serve women and children who have either been sexually exploited through the commercial sex industry, or they have been, or they are severely at risk to be exploited. So they've either been trafficked or they're at risk to be trafficked. We have 2 daytime drop-in centers. One is in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and we have one here in Mobile.
What is your role?
I work with both of our teams. I oversee both of our teams. And I also work a lot in our community. So here in Mobile, we are the only organization, not only in Southeast Alabama, but in Florida, Louisiana, or Mississippi, that has a drop-in center like Northwood, that has a program like we have. So we do not have a residential facility, but I work a lot in the community. For a few years, I did trainings, but I work with donors. I work closely with Strickland, the juvenile justice system, but I also work with our team, and I've case managed for several years. I love working directly with the girls. I call everybody the girls. They could be 40, they could be 30. So I've done some case management, and I'll go in and visit them in the juvenile justice system. I kind of have my hands in all of it, but in the last year or so, we have an amazing team here, so I've been able to move out of some of the things for a while because we just didn't have the funding. We're a small organization. I did everything here, but we have an amazing team now, and I don't have to do everything, so I'm able to work really a lot with community partnerships, trainings, donor development, and still working with the girls.
Do you ever tell the girls that you're working with what you went through?
So that's a great question, and I don't ever tell, I think I shared this with you, I don't ever tell anyone everything because it's not appropriate. But there comes, the way I usually describe it is there comes a point with every lady or girl I work with, at some point I have to share, and I usually know when it is, but there comes a point when some part of my story needs to be shared with them. And this is the reason I tell them, not just to build trust with them, to establish a foundation of trust, but I usually follow that by telling them, and that's how come I know that you are worth fighting for. That's how come I'm not going to give up on you, because I very easily could have been you, and I know that you're worth fighting for.
Right. So, I mean, you provide a concrete example.
I do.
Of somebody who can overcome this.
Because a lot of them, they don't understand. Everyone else gives up on them, or this, like, why do you care so much? I care because you're worth fighting for.
What have you learned about yourself, given everything you've been through?
Here's something that I've learned that I know to be true about me. I don't write people off. Now, that might sound like, well, this lady has boundary issues. It doesn't mean I'm jumping into the pit to fight for every person. And I might not be the person you need, right, for your fight. It might not be healthy. I might not be the person to get you through. But I don't believe that any person is too far gone, that they can't find redemption. I don't give up on people.
What advice would you give to, if there's some girls listening to this show that have been sexually abused, what advice would you give them?
It's not who you are. No matter what has happened to you, no matter what has been done to you, and maybe even choices that you've made, none of that defines you. That is not who you are. It may have been what has happened, but it's not your name. It's not who you are, and it will not always be this way.
What general advice would you give to people that are just going through a tough patch in their life? I need some help in getting through this. What general advice would you give?
I think that a lot of times we stay where we are because if there's an element of shame, no matter what's gone on, or even if it's an illness, right? There's an element of shame that we all carry. And shame is a very heavy burden to bear. And whatever that shame is, that's where it's really important to remember that it's not our identity. And if we can somehow take off, I usually refer to it as like a garment of shame. If we can somehow take off that heavy coat of shame, it changes our perspective, it changes everything for us. And then we do whatever we can to not ever put that shame on, because shame is different from guilt, whereas guilt is something I've done, right? Shame says, this is who I am. And once we get caught in that, this is who I am weak, I am this, I am that. But that's not who you are. That's not who we are. And we get to decide that. So that heavy burden of shame, whatever it is, it won't always be this way. I know I say that a lot, but it's true. It will not always be this way. If we can find a way to come out from underneath that garment of shame, then it really changes our life. And I tell our girls sometimes, like, those are old clothes and they don't fit you anymore.
Now, if somebody wants to donate to iHeart World, how would they do that? I think you talked about, you're doing fundraising and that kind of stuff. If somebody's listening and wants to donate, I guess, money or time, how can they do that?
That's a great question because we are a nonprofit. So iHeartWorld.org is our website, and you can go to that and you can find a place to donate. There's a button to donate, or you could also go to, I think it's our programs, click on that, and you go to the Rose Center, and it'll allow you to make a donation through there.
Okay. Everybody that's listening needs to do that. All right. Well, we're coming to the end, so what I do this with all my guests. I give them the parting shot. So the last words of wisdom. I'm sure I haven't asked you everything. So what have you got on your mind or on your heart that we haven't talked about?
Oh, wow. If we look and we come through the other side of pain, whatever that pain is, whatever that adversity is, right? When we find, okay, I can't go over it and I can't go under it, I have to go through it. Once we do that, I believe all pain has purpose. All of it. We just have to get on the other side of it and decide what we're going to do with it.
Well, that's exactly why I asked this question. Because to get stuff like that was great. All right, well, Crystal, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. It's been my honor having you here, and thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
This episode with Crystal Yarbrough is what Rocket Motivation is all about, overcoming difficult circumstances. To say Crystal Yarbrough had difficult circumstances may be the understatement of all time. To break out of the cycle of sexual abuse and then help other women overcome their sexual abuse is just an amazing story. Next week's guest is Lois Letchford. She's going to tell her story of how she took on the task of teaching her dyslexic son to read and how she has used her skills to help hundreds of other dyslexic students. It's going to be a great episode. See you next week. Rocket Motivation partners with Gat Creek, one of America's premier wood furniture makers. Clean, timeless designs define the Gat Creek look. Their made-to-order furniture effortlessly connects with a range of styles from modern to traditional. Check out their full range of products at gatcreek.com. If you're interested in getting my book, Get Back Up, just go to Amazon and put in Get Back Up and my name, Rod Caden. It'll pop right up. I would love it if you would subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it if you'd share it with a friend. I would like as many people to hear my message as possible. Never give up and always get back up. And we'll see you next week.